As Faust mentioned, our first speakers today are Nomeda and Gediminas Urbonas. They are artists, educators, and researchers working at the Art, Culture, and Technology program at MIT. They're also visiting professors at VU in Vilnius, among many other institutional appointments. The duo combine the disciplines of new media, urbanism, social science, ecology, and pedagogy into an integrated artistic practice, and they operate both in collaboration with institutions, para-institutionally and extra-institutionally in this work. Their work has been internationally exhibited, and the inspiration for our inviting them today was the 2018 project they curated at last Venice Architecture Biennale called Swamp Pavilion, a future learning environment. And they're currently working on a book called Swamps, A New Imagination, which is due out this coming fall, and on a Swamp School 2.0, I'm not sure if that's the official title, in Vilnius, which is a project that plugs into research taking place at a major research university and ties the humanities and the arts in with agriculture and scientific disciplines. For Nomeda and Gediminas, the swamp functions as a brain with its own logic towards the question of modernity, as a philosophy for material engagement, and as an environment for future learning, research, and production. Please welcome Nomeda and Gediminas Urbonas.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for Victoria and Faust and Schumann for inviting us here. It's really a pleasure to be in such inspiring and intellectually generous situation. And also thank you very much
to Judel and Fatima.
Yeah, for taking care of us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, and I want to start by saying that we are artists, and we are working as a collaborative duo, and we are based at MIT's program in Art, Culture, and Technology, academic program and research center that is a continuation of the CAVS Center for Advanced Visual Studies that was mentioned yesterday within the Bauhaus context. Center was founded by Bauhaus-trained artist Georgi Kepes, who was student of Moholy Nagy, and taking upon Moholy Nagy's vision in motion, Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT has had its mission to engage with the rapidly changing conditions of life, as well as the science and engineering culture at MIT. So CAVS and the founder, Kepes, saw pedagogical role of the environment in conditioning spontaneous social interaction. For Kepes, the ecological consciousness entails a renewed sense of connectedness, a reorientation within what he calls a new, higher gestalt, a dynamic assemblage of human and environment in which the increasing magnitude and complexity of interacting lives must make us realize that our future depends upon an understanding and control of our common system as self-regulating, interdependent, dynamic pattern that moves from yesterday into today and from today into tomorrow. CAVS calls for a citizenship of the environment, and that is to establish an entente with the living present. That is to create a bond between the conceptual map and underlying territory. So we are talking here about adaptive brain, that is technology interface. But something is also that is missing within this cybernetic narrative that is kind of built from a dry algorithms, and that perhaps could be called wet ontologies. In 2017, we were asked by the Architecture Fund, that is Young Architects Organization, to curate a Lithuanian pavilion for Venice Biennale Architecture Exhibition. And we proposed a swamp as a topic for a new learning environment. that is not really to stage educational program that is part of the exhibition per se, or in addition to the pavilion, but actually to stage a school as a form, as organization, that engages long malign swamp as a notion, and also suggests to change habits of thought. So why swamp? Well, Venice is a swamp, and that is a city that is built in the middle of lagoon that Venetian merchants chose as the impossible environment for building, precisely as it is the best stage to represent and demonstrate the omnipotence and the power, not only as a political organization, but also as a humans over the nature. As we know that Venice itself has a swampy past and also uncertain future. The floating city that was built atop platforms propped up and steadied by wooden stakes driven into a moving environment of the wetlands foundation. The swamp was altered but not eradicated, and instead colonized the city from within. So to engage the swamp in Venice is also to challenge the geopolitical constellation of colonial powers that represented by the national pavilions in Giardini. Lithuania, as many other countries that were colonized or occupied, do not have their own pavilion in Giardini. And of course, there is a question about reasons of building one today, right? Especially in times that are marked by radical instability and threats of total war and environmental collapse. So the question is really how relevant is to engage the project of national representation? What could be beyond national or even human? Not as is identities that separate, but commons that are in search of commoning. Thus, our proposal is a swamp with its leaking character, with its borderless and disobedient ecosystem that cannot be contained. The swamps is uncanny to architecture. It always been on a pathway of modernization and modernity. Through the history, the project of architecture has been produced by draining of the swamps, marshes and wetlands, dividing the land into the liquid, into what is useful for the agriculture, or as a solid, and the liquid into something that can be useful for the waterways, and also settlements, extracting and parceling it, expelling the indigenous, and this is all technologies of architecture and of colonization. So architecture today must embrace its uncanny, the swamp, with its hybridity, complexity, queerness, paradox, as a way to decolonize and deschool itself. Therefore, don't drain the swamp. Of course, from the history, we know that swamps were not only hopeless, dangerous, and maligned, but they also were habitats. If we look at the histories of the 17th century, of the Maroons that were African-American slaves who were brought as a forced labor to the new continent. So those fugitives built their hidden communities in this local environment, escaping and maintaining its existence by cohabiting the space, the dangerous space, with the natives and amphibians and other species. So maroon communities that are found in the Virginia, North Carolina, they bring these histories of hope.
Do you want to share our PowerPoint with the audience so we could speed up a little bit? But there are also other cultural references, what we collected during the research time. And yeah, Gediminas will share a little bit of them with you. So
we are talking also about the peat that is accumulation not only of the energy but also of the memories and hidden archives. We know that peat are also libraries as they preserve all the organic matter. And there is much more in the peat than just a fuel extraction. When we look at all the memories that are accumulated in the swamp, we find that the swamp is this mysterious place that fuels our cultural and political imagination, from horror of unknown to women power to imagination of William Blake and eco-fiction of Ursula Le Guin, and entropy of Robert Smithson, and remembering his work with Nancy Holt through the swamp in New Jersey. But when it comes to colonized territories, we look at the scholarship of Karl Albert Weber, a German scholar who was working at the Prussian Imperial Observatory of the Swamp, stationed in Bremen, and who traveled to the margins of the Prussian Empire to investigate the rationale and write a book that is looking into how the swamp can be really understood as a science, and and of course, on basis of that, how it can be made into the useful matter. But looking at the taxonomy of the peat, and actually his book is also known as the Bible of the Swamps, and serves as the major scholarly reference throughout the 20th century. He also studies the malnutritious plants and the shapes of the malnutritious plants. As we know, the swamps are very modest environment that doesn't have much of the minerals. In that sense, it is also a similar ecosystem to desert. Next to these drawings, we also find Weber's imagined life of the indigenous Lithuanian people who lived in the swamps. So to acknowledge the land and to acknowledge its history, we, also as a learning environment, we bring young architects to that swamp, that first scientifically researched swamp in Lithuania, to explore the swamp as a sensory environment, to explore its instability, its dangers, and imagine that perhaps our future classrooms can be full of unstable sensorial experiences, something that cannot be found within this trajectory that is built by the modernity. So, yeah, instability becomes learning space, and we're trying to imagine choreographies and spaces of engagement with the swamp, and imagining this future learning environment as parasiting on the edge of Giardini, suspended between the water and the land and air. So imagine this infrastructure, something that will take on experiences that would activate a sensorial body, and other ways of knowing that were exterminated or erased by the colonization, land reclamation, and knowledge classification. So
this is a final sort of synthesized proposal by the young Lithuanian architects for Venice Architecture Biennale. Yeah, the new learning environment with all these experiences, what they sort of like synthesized from the swamp.
So the swamp school infrastructure is a project of imagination, and architects' proposals were materialized as a blueprint that were printed on the swamp ponchos. So the architects themselves can sort of like responding to that leaking character of the swamp, can disperse the ideas, the imaginations, and the designs of the pavilion across the city of Venice, embodying these imaginations and carrying them throughout the city, making the school dispersed school. So organization of the school and its system and its adaptive brain is inspired by the theory of Stafford Beer, Manchester cybernetician, who's been working with the idea of the viable system, or what he is calling the brain of the firm, something that takes inspiration from the biological organization of the pond. Stafford Beers doesn't necessarily mention the swamp, but he is engaging the biological interchangeability of the species
in the pond.
In the pond, and tries to imagine that the way how we could sort of like create the future environments, especially very complex environments, where the human brain is no longer capable to manage the organization of them. We could plug them with what he's calling adaptive brain of the swamp. So the organizational logic of the natural environment would start sort of like helping and facilitating the logic of the human environment. So imagine like the chaos of the traffic in Chicago could be plugged to the chaos of the traffic in New York and could help to manage that, right? So by applying the swamp brain into existing architectural envelope of the space in Giardini, the swamp pavilion becomes an altered sensorial organism that acts far beyond exclusive human control. It transforms into a free space for unexpected encounters of architectural and artistic practice, adapting design and pedagogical experimentation to the conditions of uncertainty and ecosystemic decay. So swamp as an interface brings schools, partners, interlocutors, contributors, and participants. Of course, this
many
presentation...
of them, we're not gonna list them.
This presentation will not do it justice, really mentioning all the partners, well, we are very happy to see one of them, and very happy that Natasha will share this discourse space later afternoon. But the Swamp School is really sort of like takes upon this extracurricular and activity, and also looks at Venice Lagoon, at Venice as a biennale space, and also as a space of the pedagogy. And the way how we, with the help of the Swamp Brain, organize it, we're breaking it into the 3 chapters, loosely called Swamp Radio on Transmitting, Futurity Island on Sympoietics, and the Communism on Cohabitation. And in parallel to the school, we also organizing the manuals for the participants and to disseminate the ideas. So we have those manuals here on the table. And each manual, well, actually the manual idea is referring to Buckminster Fuller's operating manual for Spaceship Earth. These manuals bring practices of artists and designers that document the process of thinking, design, and pedagogy. and also function as a small sort of like interfaces, as a modest interfaces. And the first part in each of the manuals. So the manuals constructed after a certain pattern, where the first part interrogates idea of the swamp and the modernity of the swamp. The second looks at pedagogy, and in this case we have Kristina Lipodesva who rewrites the essay Pedagogical Turn that's been written 12 years ago from the perspective of indigenous pedagogy, where the rhythms of the weather and the weather patterns and the seasons of the year become the pedagogical shifts that sort of like constructs rhythms and concepts. And also we have a part of the manual that is dedicated to hybrid practices. We are looking into how the territory of the architecture as a discipline, for example, is being constantly violated by different other disciplines. So we're looking into the hybrid practices that emerge precisely from this enjoyment of these disciplinary violations. And of course here there are historic figures, Juan Downey, who spent
10 minutes?
Juan Downey, who is also known as Invisible Architect, who spent time with Yanomami people in Amazonas. Marianne Amisher, who is known for her psychoacoustic phenomena. And Harrisons, who's been working with biodiversity. And Jonna Friedman, who are also behind the manuals for the people's architecture.
So we only have 10 minutes more to just go quickly through the 3 chapters. And as Gediminas said, it's very unjust because all the presentations, we had like maybe 206 contributions to the whole school. So of course it's, you know, we cannot show all of them, although we should. So we just do a selection of a few. So from Swamp Radio, which is on transmitting, we can talk about hybrid radio interface constructed by Nicole Hullier, which is a parasite radio which can transmit amphibian voices, as we call them, around like 3.5 kilometers around Venice from the lagoon, but also function as a radio per se at the same time. So we enjoy that, and we also enjoy Venice as a pavilion. So you see down there in the corner, there is a swamp school headquarters, as we call them, but also we use the whole lagoon as our, you know, classroom. Yeah, exactly.
Diana Winderin, who is known for the recording of the sounds of the mating shrimp, here she brings the audible landscapes. So the school turns, well, she, through her practice, into the listening device to the environment. So the listening is important as a practice within this chapter of the Swamp Radio, and also playing the swamp with Sam Aunger, where we're using the swamp as an instrument. Also swamp as a battery for production of the energy, as in the work of Russ and Wright Smiths, that looking into the ability of the bacteria to elicit electrons. So that is, there is a big discussion about the energy, but for the Swamp Radio it's important to have its own sort of like energy system. So we could use the bacteria-made energy for sending the radio signal. And Mark Quigley, who brings the concept of human insect. We do not look like insects, but we do act like insects with the help of the antennas that we constantly use every day, trying to locate our bodies, trying to find food, trying to figure out about specific conditions of our bodies, whether it is a time to sleep or meet or eat, and this is what is actually happening with this Bauhaus project. That's starting from kind of like designing the things that may change the social, cultural, and political relations. Gradually, we end up designing our bodies.
With the help of architects, we also built the resilient infrastructure of the school. We say, like, do not drain the swamp, therefore take the pipe out of the swamp, literally, and build the architecture for the school. Of course, different scenarios, and it's also meant to be uncomfortable, not the way how you sit here or we sit here, but you have to adjust and you have to adapt your body to the pipe. And
also acoustic voids. We really take upon this infrastructural challenge and
use the space as a place for experiments. So of course students or participants, as we say them, of the school can exercise, and try different recordings from the swamp here.
So in this case, we're listening to Francisco Lopez' archive of extinct species that he recorded in Amazonas.
Also, pipe is used as an infrastructure for olfactory experience. Here, artists collect the smells of swamp and extract the certain smells and install for the somehow effect of synesthesia in the space. The second chapter is Futurity Island, and it's on sympoietics.
So it brings the dialectical tension between the swamp and the island. As we know, the islands are being inspirational for many philosophers, and they speak about the territories that are being formed from within or by the environment, whereas, but they are somehow defined, even though they're not definite. While the swamps are completely undefinable. They're constantly in becoming, and like Castoriadis, he brings this concept of magma. In this case, we could compare swamps and magmas as they all the time sort of like in the formation and in the becoming, in search for their shape.
Nevertheless, we had a little model of the swamp in the school, inside of the school in Venice, which was actually brought from Lithuania with the help of the peat company, which is extracting peat in Lithuania and exporting it to Italy. So, nevertheless, they managed to bring their scientists, and we did several workshops just studying the communities of plants and how they relate to each other and how different species thrive in Italian climate. Like, for example, here there were species which are very rare in Lithuania, and the scientists who came after a couple of months of this swamp life in Italy was astonished how thriving those species were in Italy.
Yeah, so the question was whether it was a climate or it was a discourse of the swamp school. The soap, Venetian soap workshop uses the 16th century Venetian recipe and garbage rendered in the pavilions to make the so-called entropic souvenir.
Then, of course, we explore the islands, not only the one which is like a very typical Venetian image that we have, but also the garbage island next to Venice. And the participants built the observatorium of swamp in the abandoned bunker. So they cleaned the bunker and then they installed the observatorium of the swamp.
So this is something that stays after the school, as the school travels somewhere else, but the observatory of the swamp remains in this garbage island. Maritica Potter's who is also professor in Hamburg Academy, she brings collaboration with Assemblea Sociale per la Casa, and that is Homeless People Association in Venice. Well, Venice is very good, as many other cities, neoliberal cities, to hide its homeless. So for the swamp school is essential to acknowledge things that are hidden, that are always next to us, but invisible. And also the amphibian house, that is children workshop, that uses Oscar Hansen model of the open form and involves children, Venetian children, in designing the amphibian houses with the idea that habitats, the future habitats perhaps are cohabitated and shared.
And we have 2 more minutes, 1.5 minutes, actually, for the last chapter, which is communism.
Well, we are hoping that Natasha's presentation will take upon that challenge in more detail, but communism is a term that is suggested by our interlocutors, Pascal Guélin and Nico Dox. And also the book with the same title, Suggesting New Aesthetics of the Real, is being launched in the Swamp School with Tony Negri and Santiago Cirugueda. Recetas Urbanas practice that also was mentioned yesterday. So we are happy that the swamp starts sort of like in this unruly manner, kind of like make connections with yesterday and with today and with perhaps tomorrow. And also the swamp kitchen brings this kind of like idea of ingestion and digestion, and the recipes that are designed by the several artists proposed specifically for the swamp school. And we also have tour fiction that is expands the idea of the sociability beyond the human species and suggests the commonality with others. So here there is a specific Icelandic turf house that is built of the turf, and here you can see even the scientific discovery that suggests how many bacteria species and eukaryotes are thriving in that ecosystem that supports resilience of the human body and also immunity of the people who live in this extreme wet, extreme windy, and extreme cold condition as Iceland is.
We have to stop here, and the future is there. I'll show you quickly. This is the swamp intelligence model, which was also built and still learning to sort of merge new hybrids, bear and barn, like so nature and architecture together.
So we are working here with the artificial intelligence engineer and the scientist to really propose the dialectical tension with the artificial intelligence project, proposing the so-called swamp intelligence to expand understanding of intelligence, to look at the possibility to imagine the diversity, and also imagine the future of the architecture that can sort of like take upon this challenge of imagination.
Thank you.